Hi, welcome to a special symposium in honor of Lawrence A. Blum. I just wanted to say that because that's how I first met Larry. Can I count this high? 27 years ago, I think I read his work on friendship from a book called Friendship, Altruism, and Morality. And there was this Lawrence Blum fellow who was really an amazing philosopher. So that was my first introduction. And lo and behold, 10 years ago, I got a job here. My name's Chris Zern. I teach in the philosophy department. What I just want to do is do the Master of Ceremonies thing and tell us about how the day is going to go and introduce all of our amazing presenters. First, Larry, of course, who is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Distinguished Professor of Liberal Arts and Education at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I'm not going to subject you to the long CV recap, but I'll give you the stats since they're pretty interesting. Larry started teaching at UMass Boston in 1973, is that correct? And he's published only 5 monographs and another edited book and some over 90 articles and a bunch of shorter pieces, 30 shorter pieces or so. He's lectured all over the world. He's had visiting professorships all over the United States. And another thing that's notable is of those 90 or so articles, there are some 33 reprints. So let me just tell you the titles of the books, because I think that's the thing that is going to at least give some context to some of the work that Larry has produced over the last year or two. First, Friendship, Altruism, and Morality, as I mentioned, which came out in 1989. No, 1980. I'm just reading the wrong things. 1980 was reissued in 2009. A Truer Liberty, Simone Weil and Marxism, which is co-authored with Vic Seidler. Moral Perception and Particularity, that's from 1994. That's a terrific book, by the way. I'm Not a Racist, But The Moral Quandary of Race from 2002. And High School, Race, and America's Future, What Students Have to Teach Us About Morality, Diversity, and Community. And that's from 2012. So those are just a little taste of the variety of fantastic philosophy that Larry has brought to us. Just to go through the rest of our fantastic presenters very quickly and give them all the official names, we have first Mickaella, Perina, who is a philosophy professor here at UMass Boston. And then we're going to have David Wong from Duke University, who's the Susan Fox Beischer and George D. Beischer Trinity College Arts and Science Professor of Philosophy. He's going to be on video. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here at the same time, so we can't have a simulcast, but we do have a video from him, which is really lovely. Then we're going to have a break, and at 3 o'clock, we'll reconvene from 3 to 4:30. And then we have a great panel from 3 to 4:30. First, Charles Mills, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Mira Levinson, Professor of Education at the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. Sally Haslinger, Professor of Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So that's our big panel from 3 to 4:30. Then we have a great panel from 4:40 to 5:15, which is students in this semester's Philosophy 318 Race and Racism class, which is a class that Larry developed here. We're going to have an interview with Larry. And then finally at 5:15, hopefully if we get there all on time and stuff, Larry will be delivering a keynote. And that's it. That's all my Master of Ceremonies things. It's going to be a great afternoon, and I really do thank you all for coming. And Larry, thanks for being Larry.
Hi. I hope this is working. Yeah? Okay. Okay, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm speaking on behalf of the philosophy department and on my own behalf. So Larry has been a member of our department for more than 40 years. And it is fair to say, I think, that he has impacted the culture of the department in important ways. His career as a scholar, a teacher, a mentor has been remarkable, but he has most of all been an extraordinary colleague to many of us. I believe he regards his role as a teacher and a mentor to be an important aspect of his long and distinguished career, at least as much as his role as a scholar. And I take it to be a privilege for me to say a few words about my relationship with Larry, but also his relationship to our department. I've known of Larry way before I came to the United States from Paris. But I first met him at the Eastern APA in 2003 when I was interviewing for this job. After I joined the department the following fall, a number of Larry's qualities quickly became evident to me and appealed to me in very special ways. They include, but of course are not limited to, intellectual curiosity, a true interest in others, empathy to and care for his students, and a love of teaching. Over the years, this very early appreciation and esteem for Larry has turned into a friendship. I have always been impressed with how interested Larry was in junior faculty, in and out the philosophy department. As a senior member of our department and as the chair of the personnel committee, Larry was interested not only in creating favorable conditions for junior faculty to progress towards tenure, but more fundamentally, in helping junior faculty reach their full potential and develop rewarding careers. It was clear from the very beginning that he wanted the department to be a place where junior faculty could work well and develop the type of scholarship they cared about, while being engaged with each other's work, each other's life, and providing the best teaching possible for our students. He has been supportive in more ways than I can begin to describe here. Reading drafts, providing feedback, suggesting venues to present papers, or discussing pedagogical techniques. Perhaps more importantly, since the time when the department had only 4 junior faculty, after a very long period without new hires, Larry had been organizing the Philosophy Salon, or Salon for short. Not exactly a relic of the Parisian institution of the Enlightenment, where men philosophers and women salonières played crucial but different roles. The gathering of junior faculty under the roof of our host, Larry, has been providing a place for junior faculty and progressively more or less senior faculty to engage mostly in discussion of philosophical texts from various traditions and on a wide range of topics, but on occasion, to engage in conversation about our shared working environment and beloved institution. Let me just say that while it has often been argued that the emergence of salons in Paris allowed for more leadership and involvement for women in intellectual areas at the beginning of the 18th century, I would submit that the philosophy salon, or let's say Larry's salon, fosters conversations and understanding among junior faculty across philosophical interests and traditions, and provides an important space for intellectual companionship and friendliness that reinforces the general culture of our department. I have also witnessed Larry's interest for junior colleagues and graduate students in the context of the California Roundtable on Philosophy and Race, an annual conference I co-organized with my colleague Falgonishet at Emory University. Larry has been a regular attendee, a presenter, and a supporter of the CRPR from the very beginning. And he was a keynote in 2010. As a senior race scholar, he has shown interest in the work and the career prospects of graduate students and junior faculty alike, and has been a mentor to several of them. The goal of the CRPR is to foster dialogue among those working in race studies in a continual space where constructive mentorship relationships can be developed and enhanced. Larry, as the regular attendee and a supporter, has been helping us achieve this goal in very special ways. We at the TRPR are immensely grateful for his commitment to the Roundtable. Over the course of his teaching career, Larry devotedly educated a great number of students. Not only did he dedicate a lot of time and thinking to his pedagogy, and always made it a priority to engage with each student individually and to know about their interests and their lives sometimes, but he also remains interested in their life long after they have completed their degree and leave our campus. I believe two initiatives speak to this. The first one is what is now known as the alumni event. Initiated by Larry, this event organized twice a year brings back to campus alumni of our department around a faculty member who makes a scholarly presentation followed by a discussion. The second example is a sort of tutorial, kind of confidential, that Larry organized in several occasions over the summer to allow some of his students to further their interest in a philosophical issue or in a philosophical figure. Those are ways in which Larry educated students and developed special relationship with them. In an interview with Professor Federica Berdini from the University of Bologna, Larry explains how his teaching experience at UMass Boston significantly contributed to the development of his philosophical work over the last 20 years or so. Reflecting on his years of teaching, Larry states, quote, "We were not primarily training people to become philosophy graduate students. Very few of our students go on to do that, although we nurture very strongly the ones who do. But since you couldn't think of your philosophy teaching primarily in that pre-professional way, there was no temptation to do that. So you ended up really thinking about what will be valuable to these students in becoming citizens of this society. What would you give them that would help further their own development?" End of quote. In the same interview, Larry goes on to describe how the experience of having his own children involved in Cambridge public schools impacted his scholarly trajectory and drove him to the turn toward race studies and towards philosophy of education. He also described how the scholarship of a group of African-American philosophers in the early 80s also contributed to that turn. Larry's work, I think, is motivated by his engagement with his students and more broadly with the world. Indeed, the development of Larry's philosophical identity, one might say, certainly over the past 20 years, but perhaps even earlier than that, seems to be grounded in its relationship to his social and academic environment. A bit like the French philosopher Simone Weil, who was, on his own admission, an important figure for him, and to whom, as Chris mentioned earlier, he dedicated a book published in 1989, A Truer Liberty, Simone Weil and Marxism. About Simone Weil, Larry says, quote, "I was completely enamored of Simone Weil. I think she was really fantastic. She had a very moralized view of social phenomena and was an unusually engaged intellectual. I definitely admire the fact that she wasn't just a pure philosopher. She was someone really engaged with the world, being involved with the Union and left movement in the 1930s. So she was a sort of an exemplary figure for me, both intellectually and also as an engaged person." End of quote. I think it is fair to say that Larry wanted to be, and succeeded in being, not just a pure philosopher, but an engaged philosopher. Two quick examples to illustrate my point. In his very first book, Friendship, Altruism, and Morality, first published in 1980. Larry makes a case for the role of altruistic emotions, such as compassion, sympathy, concern, or care, against a certain type of rationalism. He argued that duty and impartiality, well-known Kantian requirements, fail to explain a large number of relations, such as friendship, that are largely regarded as involving important moral issues. It is through an analysis of concrete everyday situations that Larry demonstrates that, quote, there is no general demand for impartiality, end of quote, and that no theory of beneficence or impartiality can account for, quote, certain goods internal to friendship itself, end of quote. Its more recent book, High School, Race and America's Future, What Children Can Teach Us About Morality, Diversity, and Community, engages race and racism in the context of a high school classroom. It provides a detailed analysis of how students engage with difficult material while grappling with intellectual, moral, and emotional challenges. He proposes a conceptual framework to think about the complex territory of race and racial relations in an educational context and addresses a number of very important issues. His commentaries and reflections upon students' responses are informed by his philosophical work and, moreover, by his ethical concerns. As he put it in the introduction, he approached all these matters, contemporary and historically, with a moral slant, going beyond looking at what happened and why it happened, to whether it was good or bad, right or wrong, and why. Every issue, whether it is slavery, immigration, stereotypes, moral symmetry, or expectations and potential, is indeed addressed with a moral angle. Each chapter offers a philosophical examination of issues raised by the concept of race, the practice and mechanism of racialization, and the persistence of various forms of racism. Of course, you'll hear much more about Larry's multifaceted work, from moral psychology, race studies to education, and about his philosophical method from my distinguished colleagues here. I only meant to emphasize how his scholarship, his understanding of what it means to be engaged with the world, his conception of teaching, his commitment to student learning, and to our institution mission are interrelated, at least as far as I am concerned. The teacher, the mentor, the scholar, the colleague, and the friend are one and the same from where I stand. Although, of course, it might nevertheless be very helpful to distinguish between these various roles. I have not done justice to Larry with this very brief description of what he means to me or what he means to our department. This very brief testimonial is much too short to do him justice. Suffice it to say that the Department of Philosophy was extremely fortunate to have him for so many years, and I have been fortunate to have him as a colleague and a friend. I believe I speak in the name of all of my colleagues when I say that we hope that for many years to come he will continue to be the prolific scholar and the mentor we know him to be, and that he will continue to be in contact with us individually and collectively, and will continue to engage our works. His retirement needs not be a separation, for, as I believe the French philosopher Simone Weil, once again, wrote in Gravity and Grace, when friends are far apart, there is no separation. Thank you.
Hello, Larry, Christopher, Sally, Mickaella, Charles, Mira, and students of philosophy of race and racism. And perhaps to some of my other old friends from the Boston Moral Psychology Group. Larry, you might remember that many years ago I introduced myself to you through a letter I wrote after having read Friendship, Altruism, and Morality. It was the first and only fan letter I've written. I was so struck by the way you held moral theory to account for the richness and complexity of moral life. I was exhilarated and inspired because you showed a way to connect my central philosophical concerns to my most meaningful experiences as a human being. It not only gave those philosophical concerns a new vitality and urgency, but it also gave a new depth to the way I interpreted my experiences. Our conversations, both inside and outside the Boston area moral psychology group, played an enormous role in whatever is worth reading in my own work. I want to connect one of Larry's most influential themes, the importance of moral particularity and perception, to his work on moral exemplars. In turn, I shall connect his work on exemplars with some recent work in Confucian philosophy, for here too, moral exemplars are extremely important. I touch on the importance of exemplars for a question that Larry has said Iris Murdoch raised as a distinctly philosophical question: how we can morally improve and think well about the obstacles to improvement. Larry rightly says that this is one of Murdoch's lasting contributions, and it is, I must say, one of his. And he has taken it in directions such as race and racism that Murdoch never did. Let me begin with Larry's characterization of moral particularity as a substantial part of the moral life that involves, in his words, responding to particular persons whose lives our lives are bound up with or touch in some way. That's from Moral Perception and Particularity. Moral particularity does not involve drawing on or responding to the demands of general principles such as utility or the categorical imperative. It starts from the agent's perception of encounter or of relationship with particular persons. And this perception constructs what the agent faces in the first place. This perception, Larry says, is often a sensitivity to sorts of particular features of the situation: injustice, dishonesty, racism, physical pain, and discomfort. In driving home the importance of perception to particularity, Larry often uses what I would call, in his honor, the Blumian case. It presents a situation that immediately strikes one as familiar, narrated with psychological realism and moral sensitivity. Consider Larry's case of Tim, a white male who is waiting for a taxi at a train station. Waiting near him are a black woman and her daughter. A cab drives up, passes the woman and her daughter, and stops to pick up Tim, who, with relief, climbs into the cab. Once in the cab, Tim construes the situation retrospectively in a different way. The driver has passed up the woman and her daughter, perhaps because he didn't want black people in his cab, or did not want to go to the sort of neighborhood where he imagines the woman will ask him to go. He now infers racism as playing a role in what happened. Larry points out that the perception in this case is complex, that it involves elements of construal, inference, and imagination. And what Tim now does about this new perception of the situation can be complex and requires judgment. Should he make the driver go back to see if the woman and her daughter are still there to be picked up? Should he try to engage the driver in a conversation about why he did not stop for them? Should he simply make the driver stop and let Tim get out of the cab? Larry observes that three aspects of particularity are pertinent to Tim's deliberation: the perception of the particular situation, a particularistic attitude that consists in being alive to the way the given situation might differ from superficially similar situations, and detailed particularity, getting a detailed understanding and sensitivity to the particular situation. I now want to go to Larry's work on moral exemplars as another avenue for exploring moral particularity and the role of perception. Moral exemplars are persons of moral excellence. Many of them exhibit a particularistic responsiveness to other persons whose lives, their lives are bound up or touch in some way. Many deploy particularistic attitudes and detail particularity in judging what to do in situations they perceive to be a certain way. But what I'd like to stress is another kind of particularity that emerges when we think about the range of people whose excellence we're drawn to. Moral excellence itself appears as richly diverse and resistant to regimentation or subsumption according to principle-based moral theories, such as utilitarianism or Kantianism. To chart this range of moral excellence, I begin with a pair of comparisons Larry draws between types of moral exemplars. The moral hero compared to the Murdochian moral saint, and the responder compared to the idealist. The moral hero takes on a project of bringing about a great good or avoiding a great evil and faces risk or danger. They have a morally worthy motivation for taking on the project, and the motivation is deeply rooted compared to others they have. Finally, there's a relative absence of unworthy motivations. Oskar Schindler, the German industrialist who during the Second World War managed to save over 1,000 Jews by taking them on as workers, is a fascinating candidate for a moral hero. His motivations for starting an enamelware factory in Nazi-occupied Poland are definitely mixed. Hiring Jews as workers appears to have been initially motivated by its being cheaper than hiring non-Jewish Poles. Moreover, Schindler loved to party, had affairs outside his marriage, was able to effectively lie to accomplish his ends, and even later, when it appears that his primary motivation became the desire to save lives, he also is attached to his self-image as the savior father of his workers. By the end of the war, he has deployed his considerable persuasive powers to cajole and bribe Nazi officials to let him continue using his factory as a shelter for Jews, at the cost of sacrificing whatever money he had made and enduring great risk. What should we think of Schindler? Larry, while acknowledging the mixture of motivations and admirable and not so admirable traits, makes judgments about the comparative depth of Schindler's competing motivations and judges him to be a moral hero on balance. There's a larger context in which Larry appears to be making this judgment that is brought out by comparing the moral hero with the Murdochian moral exemplar, a figure emerging from Iris Murdoch's novels and from her collection of philosophical essays, The Sovereignty of Good. This exemplar is the good, humble, selfless person. They are not necessarily engaged in a great moral project like Schindler, but may, like Ed Corcoran in Mary Gordon's novel Men and Angels, quietly surmount great challenges in everyday life. Ed cares for his very sick wife, who is unbalanced in mind and a trial to live with, and their young son. He treats them and others with kindness and respect, where one might have expected bitterness, resentment, and envy. The Murdochian exemplar's motivations exhibit a much greater degree of purity than is required of the moral hero, and Larry is explicit in judging that the moral hero can meet a lower standard of purity because of the moral project. Furthermore, that project may occupy a relatively short period of time, as Schindler's did. He never did anything remotely comparable in moral worth before or after the war. The measure of a Murdochian exemplar, by contrast, is closer to what is done in a lifetime, at least after selfishness has been transcended. The second comparison includes the idealist who adapts and acts on general moral values and principles, which others see as higher or more demanding, though the idealist often does not see them that way. A person who fit that type is André Trocmé, who led the French village of Le Chambon in its sheltering of thousands of refugees, most of them Jews, from the Nazis. His values were resistance to evil, nonviolence, and the cherishing of each individual. The idealist contrasts with the responder, who has no worked out general values or principles, or at least does not act on them. Rather, they simply do the morally right thing in the situation at hand. Magda Trachme, Andre's wife, was a responder who saw his ideals as grandiose. She instead responded to people as individuals with particular needs, say for food or a coat. Their types of moral excellence complemented each other. She helped ground his ideals in a concrete reality, while Andre was a planner. Magda interacted with the refugees on a face-to-face basis. Individuals can exemplify more than one type of moral excellence. Andre was a moral hero, an idealist, and perhaps a Murdochian exemplar. Magda was a responder, a hero, and most definitely a Murdochian exemplar. Schindler was a responder, a hero, and most definitely not a Murdochian exemplar. Together, these individuals make up a diversified portrait of moral excellence that Larry puts up against Susan Wolf's portrait of moral saints. Wolf draws her portrait up to the specification either of the utilitarian commitment to impartially promote the greatest good for all, or the Kantian commitment to doing one's duty for duty's sake. Her point is that, however morally admirable such moral saints are, they are not appealing from the standpoint of personal well-being. They are grimly, boringly, and self-righteously dedicated to the moral ideals at the cost of pursuing whatever their passions are or might have been. What Larry points out is that if we consider the actual persons we respect and admire, we find not the one-dimensional characters of modern moral theory, but people who enjoy exciting lives like Schindler did, or who find the meaning of their lives in how they respond to others on a daily basis, as Magda Trachme did. Unlike the judgmental and self-righteous saints in Wolf's critique of moral sainthood, we find an Andre Trachme who managed to make people feel that he was indebted to them for whatever they could do to help. Larry restores the admiration we feel for exemplars. He restores their ability to move us. And I want to follow up his illuminating work on exemplars with two suggestions. First is to relate his work on moral exemplars with Exemplar's moral theory, as developed by Linda Zagzebski and deployed by Amy Oberding in her interpretation of the Confucian Analects. Instead of a top-down derivation of conceptions of moral excellence, starting with one's preferred normative theory, we start instead with our admiration for particular people and what they do. The inspiration for such an epistemology in Zagzebski and Oberding is the investigation of natural kinds. We identify something in the world that is of interest to us, but we do not presume that we know what it is in any deep or systematic way. Rather, we identify it through our encounters with that thing. Goodness is like that, we may say, pointing to people such as Schindler and the Trachmes, who have elicited our admiration. Theory, in the form of a systematic conception, perhaps of the deep structure of moral excellence, may result, but that emerges from investigation starting with concrete encounters with exemplars. Our reactions in these encounters may not be as simple as wanting to be like them, because their characters and their locations in historically and culturally specific worlds may forestall a simple imitative response. But we think we can learn something about moral excellence from them, and something we may, with suitable adaptation, apply to our own lives. We may even formulate conceptions of moral excellence with some degree of generality about them, as we may be able to identify qualities and relationships between these qualities that are possessed by all or many exemplars. We might even check to see if utilitarian or Kantian principles fit some exemplars, but we will not assume that moral excellence is defined by such principles. I do not mean to endorse all aspects of Exemplar's virtue theory as developed by Zagzebski, but the general outlines as sketched here seem quite compatible with Larry's approach to exemplars as sources of moral knowledge and inspiration. Oberding's interpretation of the Analects is itself a fruitful development of Zagzebski's theory. She interprets the text as a record of the interactions of Confucius and his students as they engage in inquiry after the nature of moral excellence. They discuss admired historical figures of the past and their contemporaries as possible or actual moral exemplars. There is, of course, Confucius himself, who is viewed as an exemplar by his students. But some of the most fascinating parts of the text and of Oberding's analysis of the text concerned Confucius's interactions with students who have significant moral weaknesses as well as strengths. Zilu is a warrior soldier who is brave, decisive, loyal, and utterly unafraid to show the world what he thinks and who he is. He is also impulsive and has no patience for the task of learning and reflection. Repeatedly, Confucius scolds Zilu for the latter qualities, but the affectionate bonds between them are obvious. A student who contrasts with Zilu is Zagun, who is afraid to show the world his weaknesses and therefore hides who he is through technically perfect performances of ritual that are devoid of empathy and feeling. Part of what we admire in Zilu is his transparency. What you see is what you get. By contrast, a major weakness of Zagun is his opacity. We encounter in the text such psychologically subtle portraits of persons who are trying to become better, and of Confucius, who knows them well, trying to serve, to use an Aristotelian metaphor, as a mirror to them. We learn much about moral excellence through learning the challenges to its achievement faced by particular people. One lesson I take from this exemplar's reading of the Confucian text is the illumination to be gained from taking, as exemplars, people who are very much less than perfect, admiring them for their strengths but learning from the weaknesses they struggle with. I, for one, know both impatience and impulsiveness and the urge to hide who I am, and becoming aware of these qualities in myself perhaps has helped me to deal with them better. This brings me to my second suggestion, returning to Schindler in particular. I suggest letting up some on the desire to grade exemplars on measures such as purity of motivation and depth of motivational commitment, and to be open to what they have to teach us about the unexpected complexity and ambiguity of moral excellence. To be sure, a certain amount of grading is unavoidable. Schindler had been primarily motivated by his self-flattering image as savior father of his Jews. He certainly would be less worthy of our admiration. With Larry, I assume this not to be the case. Even so, it is not implausible that a mixture of motivations operated within Schindler up to the end. And I am not sure that a better person, in some motivationally pure sense of better, could have done what Schindler did. It is impossible, for instance, for me to imagine Andre or Magda Trachme in his place, able to accomplish what he did. A person has to have something of the rogue, to have the rogue's self-confidence, to deceive and charm Nazi officials for as long as Schindler did. In Schindler's case, moral excellence appears to have been an alchemy of traits that in many circumstances would not enable a person to accomplish the morally admirable. But in his circumstances, again the particular, are ripe for the accomplishment of something great. From the Analects, we learned that identifying weaknesses may shed light on what must be overcome to achieve moral excellence. But from Schindler, we may learn that one's weaknesses are not always weaknesses, given the particular circumstances. The other factor that makes me want to let up some on the desire to grade Schindler on his motivation is the role of others in what happened. We tend to grade people individually because it makes for more clear-cut report cards, but doing so may obscure the ways in which excellence arises from interaction between people. Abraham Bankier worked closely with Schindler in the Polish factory, and according to historian David Crow, ran the day-to-day operations. He was masterful in the wartime black market, where he risked his life over and over again to make money to keep the factory going. In fact, Schindler started the factory with more Polish than Jewish workers, and it was Bankier who prodded Schindler to hire more Jewish workers. One of the workers in the Polish factory said that without Bankier, there would have been no Schindler. Itzhak Stern also worked with Schindler and was a father figure to him. Schindler later praised Stern for his, quote, high ethical values, his fearless willingness to help, his sacrificial efforts, and for his brothers, combined with modesty in his own life. And this, testified Schindler, earned his great admiration and respect. This from Crow. Schindler's wife, Emily, herself was honored after the war for her efforts to save and shelter Jewish workers. What the Anlech suggests, and the people who worked with Schindler illustrate, is that moral excellence is often born of relationships and joint efforts, of people who inspire each other and bring out the best in each other. And this brings me to my final thought for you, Larry. Thank you, for I'm sure I am a better person because of our friendship.
Great. So I just really, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank Chris and Vendela for putting together this event and all the work that I know that went into it. I taught at UMass Boston for 45 years, and the philosophy department and the wider UMass community has been my true professional and intellectual home. I do want to express my deep appreciation for my colleagues in the philosophy department. I can't believe my good fortune in ending up with you all for so many years, though I did have a role in hiring every one of you, so it's not totally a coincidence. But I also, very much appreciate my colleagues outside the philosophy department who are part of the UMass Boston project, some of whom are here today. I want to appreciate also my thousands of students, my UMass Boston students over my many years. Teaching you all has been a really deep source of meaningfulness in my life, and I want to thank you all for that. And finally, members of the Boston area philosophy community and beyond, whom I've worked with and been colleagues with for all these many decades. So I'm not quite sure, a normal setup is somebody says something to you and then they're right there and then you can say something back to them. So that's not going to work with David very much. I do want to thank Mickaella, though, who's been such a wonderful friend and a really spectacular colleague for the 15 years or so, which your talk allowed me to infer was the number of years that you've been at UMass. And I've learned so much from you, Mickaella, and so appreciate your colleagueship and kind of intellectual interlocutorship. So David was such an important person in my own development as a moral philosopher. I hadn't exactly remembered his writing me a note about friendship, altruism, and morality, but we lived several blocks away from each other and didn't know each other. He was at Brandeis for many, many years. But I do remember first meeting him and coming into his apartment and finding this incredible soulmate, a real kindred spirit. We were really interested in the same kinds of moral issues. We were interested in kind of rich, particular cases and sort of reflecting on them. And we were, together somewhat going against some of the dominant trends of the 80s. And David's friendship has just been completely invaluable to me. I mean, he brought up so many things that that were an important part of my own formation in the years when moral philosophy was my central concern, which it hasn't been for maybe 20 years or so. I do work in moral philosophy, and as Mickaella said, I kind of bring a moral lens in a way to everything, but these developments in moral philosophy, like Zagzebski's elaboration of this idea of the moral exemplar, I didn't really even know that existed, and the Confucian tradition, which David has gone on to become one of the premier American scholars of that tradition. I haven't kind of gone into that tradition to sort of think more about the exemplar issue. It was an issue that at the time really, it's just amazing how obsessed I was with the idea of moral exemplars, and it was partly because of the article by Susan Wolf that David mentioned that was called Moral Saints. It was a very influential article written in about 1982. It's an article that I basically thought was intellectually one of the most brilliant articles I had ever read, but was also morally repulsive. And I just was struggling with those two things for years and trying to figure out some way to say something interesting about that article because of that duality of it. I didn't know who Susan Wolf was. She's subsequently become a friend of mine. The person I inferred from the moral repulsive dimension of her work, she's not in the least bit like that. She's like a wonderful, very morally serious person. And anyway, my own work on moral exemplars kind of grew out of that. But also one semester I taught at UCLA, and I was replacing a very distinguished British philosopher named Philip of Foote, who by coincidence was a very close friend of Iris Murdoch's. And I had Foote's office while she was on leave, and she only had one book in her office, and it was, I mean, she must have had them at home or something. And that book was Thomas Keneally's Schindler's List. This was in 1982. Of course, most people now think of Schindler's List through Steven Spielberg's film about it from 1993, but this was all before all that. And I thought, well, Philip of Foote is reading this book, and it's the only one in her office. Probably I should read it as well. And I was just completely enthralled with the figure of Schindler. And I was pleased when Spielberg made a good pass at sort of portraying him in a movie that had many excellent aspects and some problematic ones as well. But in any case, that's how I got sort of so obsessed with Oskar Schindler. And you can see David and I, that's something we had together. And I agree, I just want to say, I agree with David's, the suggestion he made at the end. Well, let me step back a minute. So in moral philosophy, the emphasis is primarily on the individual moral agent and what that agent does or what that agent is like or what character traits they have. And at the end of his presentation, David suggested kind of broadening out that framework a little bit so that you think of morally excellent people or people who are trying to be better than they are, not only as a struggle of that particular individual, which is sort of the way Iris Murdoch also frames it and the way that I was thinking about it in the 80s, but as my own work has become sort of more political, I sort of agree more with the point that David was making, that we think of moral excellence in somewhat more collective terms and somewhat more political terms as well. That is, that people's ability to sort of rise to their better selves depends on relationships that they're part of and communities that they're part of. And that kind of opens up to sort of thinking about structural features of the society as well. So I very much agree with that criticism he made. I think I'll stop there actually and just see if you all have any questions. Of course, I can't answer for David. I might be able to actually, now that I think about it, but you could try.
We might have better luck with conversation on the next set of panels because we're going to have a panelist and then we're going to have you respond and then
Right.
we'll have a chance for conversation.
Yeah, sure, but. Well, no, wait for the mic. Oh, you, and then, okay, yeah. George.
Yeah,
Oh, hi,
Larry, you, I think both of us sort of went over the top on Simone Weil. Her brother insisted on getting the pronunciation right, and then of course he always said Simone Weil. So my question is that, as you note in the book that you co-authored, she had many fascinating qualities, but she had some pretty fascinating, unpleasant ones.
Yeah.
One of which I think, as you said, is her wholly negative attitude toward not just historical Judaism, but to the way it worked out philosophically and especially theologically. And I wonder how you balanced that out. I mean, now as you look back on it.
Yeah, so I was very involved with Simone Weil, and I have that 1989 book that my very dear friend Vic Seiler and I wrote together. But I have to say that after that book was out, I kind of went off her a little bit. And it's only in recent years that there's been kind of deeper scholarly work about her very problematic views about both Jews and Judaism. And I talked to Ben Browdy, who's done some work on this about that. And so, but because I haven't really been involved in Simone Weil, I don't go to the yearly conferences anymore. I haven't been forced to kind of put the different pieces together. I mean, I think it's quite fascinating, as your question suggests, that her views about Jews aren't just like views she had about Jews. They sort of permeate her whole way of thinking about a lot of other things too. So, yeah, I mean, it would be very challenging. It's just not something I felt like doing.
Probably one of your students will work it out.
Oh, hi. I was raising this because this didn't quite come up in any of the...
I'm sorry.
Oh, can you hear me?
I just couldn't
this
make it
hasn't come up yet, but one of the things that's interesting about your work is that it's always like ahead of the curve. Like
Very-
you're always
Always what?
ahead of the curve.
Oh.
You're always like, you in particularism, you were sort of one of the early people working on that. You critiqued Kant, and you were one of the first sort of critics of Kant. You also were one of the first philosophers of race that kind of hit the mainstream. And I've just always been interested in this. I mean, I can't ask like, how did you get ahead of the curve? But I wanted to ask more sort of thinking in terms of like the discipline of philosophy and opening up, alternative conceptions like early on. I'd be curious to know how you did that because, there's like, I think 3 to 4 fields where you were like a pioneer in philosophy. You've done this multiple times. And I think it's sort of interesting to know how was your work received? Like, what did you do to kind of get your work out there? How did you get the interest in your work when you were always thinking kind of a little bit ahead of people a lot? That happened a lot.
Well, thank you for that question, Lisa. I do want to, this is Lisa Rivera, a colleague from the philosophy department, and I wanted to mention that your work has really influenced me in this turn that I described off of David's thing about sort of moving moral philosophy in a more political direction. Lisa kind of articulated her own work as being on a kind of interface of morality and politics, and I'd never heard anyone say that before. It really had a big effect on me, so thank you for that. Because I don't, well, let me start with the race thing. So I wasn't ahead of the curve on race. I just was one of the first white philosophers to get down with race. So black philosophers had been banging on the door, through the 80s and late 70s, maybe. Well, Bernie Boxall's articles, were maybe from the mid 70s, and that was a tough slog. So I think Tommy Lott was a member of our department in the 80s. He's a kind of prominent black philosopher, and I learned quite a lot from him. So I felt that I was sort of a latecomer on that one, but it's true that among white philosophers, I kind of got into that a little bit on the near side. But I never thought of myself in the way that your question is asking. So in a way, because I didn't think of myself under the description, how do I get this stuff out because it's ahead of the curve, I don't have an answer. I mean, I didn't pay attention to getting my stuff anywhere. I just did my work, and then, you know what I mean? People are so much more, these days, they're so much more tuned into how do you market yourself, and I just wasn't really like that. So, I mean, so that's the answer to that. I mean, I don't know what to say. Of course, I was very pleased that the book, Friendship, Altruism, and Morality, was sort of taken up in various places within philosophy, but also allied fields, political theory, kind of feminist philosophy a little bit, religious studies. But I never tried to do that. So I'm sorry, that's a really disappointing answer.
So let's